The man had been walking since dawn, his boots coated in fine red dust, his shoulders bent beneath the weight of a worn saddlebag that carried little more than a blanket, a water skin, and a few strips of dried meat. He was in his late 30s, maybe 40, his face hard and lined from years of exposure to sun and wind, his beard left to grow uneven. He had fought in the war more than a decade ago and carried the memory of it like a stone pressed against his ribs. Faces gone, orders followed, choices that left him hollow. Since then, he had lived from job to job, drifting across territories, working a season on a ranch, guiding freight wagons, breaking horses, never staying long enough to be remembered. He had no family left, no claim to land. What pushed him forward now was not purpose but the simple drive to stay alive one more day. The desert around him stretched wide and empty, the sun sharp on the horizon. His horse, his last horse after losing two others to thirst and one to thieves, snorted softly as it followed, ribs faintly visible under a coat of dust. He told himself he needed to conserve the animal, not ride it to death, and so he walked more often than he rode. There was no destination ahead, only the hope of reaching the trading post another day's journey north, where he might sell a hide, trade for ammunition, or simply find shade for a night. That was when he noticed something unusual. A faint movement by a wash of rock not far from the trail. At first, he thought it was an animal, perhaps a coyote or a wounded deer. He stopped, squinting through the glare, his hand instinctively brushing against the butt of the revolver at his side, though he did not draw it. As he stepped closer, he saw her. The girl couldn't have been more than 17. Apache, by her features and the way her dark hair was braided with strips of rawhide. She was lying against a slab of stone, her ankle swollen, her dress torn at the knee, her arms scraped as if she had fallen while fleeing. The leather strap of a broken moccasin hung loose from her foot. Her breathing was uneven, shallow, and her eyes flickered open at the sound of his boots. For a moment, they both froze, the man staring down, the girl staring up with a sharp, watchful look of someone who expected more harm. Her lips parted, but no words came. Fear was written plain in her eyes, and his own chest tightened at the sight. He knew what it meant for her to see him, a white man, armed, dusty, and alone. Someone who might finish her rather than help. His first instinct was to step back, to avoid the situation altogether. Trouble had a way of clinging to him, and he had survived this long by steering clear of it. Yet something in the way she tried to rise, teeth gritted in pain as her body betrayed her, struck him. She was no threat. She was stranded, injured, and left behind by her people, or so it seemed. And he recognized the look in her face, because he had worn himself once, years ago, lying wounded on a battlefield where no one came back for him. The horse shifted restlessly behind him, and he glanced at it, then at the girl. He knew what it meant to give it up. Without the animal, he would be on foot in unforgiving country, miles of open desert with little water. The horse was his chance to reach the next post alive, but he also knew she would not survive without it. He crouched beside her slowly, careful not to startle her. "Easy," he said, though he knew she understood little of his words. His voice was low, calm, the tone more important than the meaning. Her breathing quickened, but she didn't pull back. He studied her ankle, a bad sprain, maybe broken. She couldn't walk. He looked at the raw scrapes on her arms, at the thinness of her frame. She was in no state to fight or flee. He thought about turning away, but the idea of leaving her in the dirt clawed at him, and the shame of it sat heavier than the saddlebag on his shoulders. With a long breath, he stood, took the reins of his horse, and guided it toward her. The girl's eyes widened in disbelief, confusion cutting through her fear. He slipped the reins into her hand, closing her fingers around the leather gently. "It's yours," he said, voice steady though his stomach tightened at the reality of what he had done. The words meant little to her, but the gesture was clear. He had just given her the only lifeline he possessed. The horse whickered softly as she clung to the reins, staring at him as if she could not understand why a stranger would hand over his only means of survival. He didn't have an answer for her. All he knew was that it felt less like a choice and more like the only thing he could live with. He pulled his blanket roll from the saddle, slung it over his shoulder, and stepped back, leaving her the animal. He could feel his throat dry and tight, the fear pressing in now that he realized what it meant for him. But he forced himself to keep walking beside her horse as the sun lowered, knowing he had crossed a line he couldn't step back from. The sun had already dropped low when a man and the Apache girl stopped at shallow dip in the desert floor where a few dry shrubs clung stubbornly to the ground. He had been watching her closely as they moved, noticing the way she winced each time the horse shifted beneath her weight, her injured ankle keeping her from dismounting on her own. He eased her down slowly, bracing her with one arm until she sat on the hard ground, and then led the horse away to find a patch of grass. The desert was unforgiving at night, the temperature already falling sharply, and he knew without a fire they would both freeze. He knelt to gather mesquite branches and brittle sticks, his hands working steadily, though his mind was restless with the reality of what had happened that day. She was still watching him as if trying to measure whether he was safe or dangerous. He understood why. White men had not been kind to her people. If she trusted him now, it was only because she had no choice. He tried not to meet her eyes too often, careful not to let her feel cornered. Instead, he focused on the fire, striking flint until a thin flame caught and spread across the dry wood. He fed it slow, small pieces at first, until it glowed enough to take the chill out of the air. The firelight drew her face out of shadow, young, drawn with exhaustion, her cheeks smeared with dirt, her lips cracked from thirst. From his pack, he pulled a small tin cup and poured in some water, then pushed it across the dirt toward her. She hesitated, then lifted it with both hands and drank, the water dribbling down her chin. For the first time, he saw a flicker of something other than fear, relief. He let her drink until the cup was empty before filling it again, though he measured carefully, knowing how little they had left. He unwrapped a strip of dried venison and handed it to her. She studied him, still cautious, before taking it. She ate slowly, glancing up at him between bites, as if expecting him to demand something in return. He kept his distance, chewing on a smaller piece himself, the taste dry and salty, enough to keep the hunger from gnawing. The silence stretched long. She did not speak much of his language, and he none of hers, but the quiet itself carried meaning. He thought about the questions pressing against him. Where had she come from? Why was she alone? What had left her so broken on the trail? But he did not ask. Prying would only deepen her suspicion. What mattered was that she was alive, and he had chosen to carry that burden whether or not he was ready for it. She shifted once, lifting her injured foot so the firelight revealed the swelling more clearly. He knew it was bad, worse than just a sprain. It would be weeks before she could walk properly. He pulled a strip of cloth from his saddlebag, tore it into two lengths, and crouched beside her. She tensed as he reached for her ankle, her hand twitching toward the small knife at her waist, but he lifted his palms and spoke softly, "Help. Just help." She stared hard at him, searching for deception, and after a long pause, she nodded faintly. He wrapped the cloth firm but careful, his rough hand steady despite the tension in his chest. He had bound wounds on the battlefield before, but doing it now for a stranger, an Apache girl, felt different. He could sense her watching every move, deciding whether he was the kind of man to be feared or trusted. When it was done, he sat back. She looked at her foot, then at him, her eyes unreadable, before muttering a few quiet words in her language. He didn't understand, but the tone was not hostile, almost like thanks. As the fire burned low, exhaustion caught up with him. His body ached from days of walking, his throat raw from dust, yet he forced himself to stay awake, to keep guard. She leaned against a stone, her eyes half closed, the horse tethered nearby. For the first time since he had given her the reins, she no longer looked ready to flee or fight. Instead, she wrapped the blanket he had passed her around her shoulders and let her head droop forward in sleep. The man sat staring into the fire, thinking of what he had done. He had no clear reason for giving up his horse, no plan for what would come next. Maybe he couldn't stand to walk past another human left to die. Maybe he wanted to believe he was still capable of decency after all the years he had spent running from who he'd been. Whatever it was, it had tied him to her now, and he knew the road ahead was going to be harder than anything he had expected. He pulled the blanket tighter around himself, feeling the cold bite through his clothes. The desert was quiet, only the crackle of the fire and the occasional snore of the horse breaking the silence. His eyes grew heavy, but he kept his revolver close at hand and his ears open. In the back of his mind, one thought circled without rest. If her people were alive and searching, they would find him here with her, and when that moment came, he would have no way to explain who he was or why he had helped. Still, as he looked across the fire at her fragile frame wrapped in his blanket, he told himself he would face that trouble when it came. For now, she was alive, and that was enough. The fire had burned to gray ash by the time the man stirred awake, his back stiff from sleeping upright against a rock. He had not meant to close his eyes at all, but exhaustion had pulled him under despite the cold. The first light of morning cut across the desert, and when he turned his head, he saw the Apache girl still wrapped in his blanket, her chest rising and falling in steady rhythm. For a moment, he sat silent, watching her breathe, listening to the quiet. She was alive, and that alone felt like a victory after the uncertainty of the night. He rose carefully, pulling the blanket from his own shoulders and laying it over her again. His body ached, his mouth dry, but he pushed aside his hunger. He walked to the horse, checked the animal's hooves, and stroked its dusty mane, whispering a few words out of habit. The horse looked at him with dull eyes, tired but strong enough to carry on. He knew it should have been his legs resting across the saddle, but he had made his choice, and now he would walk until his boots wore thin. When the girl awoke, she startled at first, her eyes darting quickly to him. She relaxed only when she saw the horse tethered nearby and the fire still smoldering. He offered her the water skin, waiting until she had taken her fill before drinking himself. He thought about the questions still unanswered from the night before, where her kin were, why she was alone, how she had been injured, but he kept them unspoken. Pressing her for answers would only sharpen her fear. All he needed to know was that she could not walk, and he could not leave her. He helped her onto the horse, his hand steady as he lifted her by the arm and leg, mindful of her injury. She did not resist, though her eyes searched his face as if trying to see his intent. When she was settled, he looped the reins into her hands, then began walking north, the desert sun already rising hot against the back of his neck. The hours dragged. Dust clung to his boots, and sweat ran down into his beard. Each step sent a dull ache up his legs. His thoughts circled in silence. How far to the next creek bed? How long the horse would last without real rest? How quickly their water would run out? But every time he glanced back, he saw her sitting straighter in the saddle than before, her hand firm on the reins, her eyes following him closely. There was less suspicion now, replaced by something closer to study. At midday, they reached a dry creek where a few stubborn plants had rooted in the sand. He dug with his hands until a shallow pool of murky water gathered, enough for the horse to drink and for them to wet their lips. He shared dried venison again, passing it to her first, then chewing on the small piece that remained. She seemed puzzled that he ate less, her brow furrowing as if weighing whether he was foolish or generous. After a moment, she broke her portion in two and handed one half back to him. He hesitated, then accepted. It was the first gesture she had made on her own, and he recognized it for what it was, a sign she understood he was not her enemy. Later, as they moved on, she spoke a single word in halting English, pointing at herself. Nalin. He realized she was telling him her name. He nodded, repeating it as best he could. Nalin. She gave the faintest nod in return, then pointed at him, waiting. He cleared his throat and used to speaking his own name after weeks of silence. Elias. She repeated it carefully, almost testing it, then looked away as if satisfied. It was not much, but it was a start, a thread tying them together in the empty land. By the time the sun began to fall, Elias's steps were heavier, his muscles burning from the strain. He forced himself not to stumble, unwilling to show weakness. The girl, Nalin, watched him from the horse, her expression unreadable, though her hand lifted once as if she meant to offer the reins back to him. He shook his head and kept walking. The horse was hers now, and he would not take it back. As the sky dimmed, they stopped again to build a small fire. Elias worked the flint with shaking hands, his body close to giving out. He caught her watching him closely, and this time, the fear that had marked her every glance was softer, dulled by the rhythm of the day. She saw he was not strong, not an untouchable figure of authority, but a man struggling as much as she was. When the fire finally caught, he leaned back against his pack, chest heaving with tired breath. Nalin sat near the flame, her injured ankle stretched out before her hands wrapped tight in his blanket. After a long silence, she murmured something in her own tongue, the words quiet but steady. Elias didn't understand, but the tone was no longer sharp. It was calmer, as if she was speaking not to ward him off but to share a thought with him. He closed his eyes, the sound of her voice lingering in the air. It reminded him that he was no longer entirely alone. For the first time in years, he felt that carrying someone else's burden might not break him. It might give him reason to keep walking. The night had been long and restless. Elias dozed in short bursts, his hand never far from the revolver resting by his thigh, every sound in the desert pulling his eyes open again. He was used to sleeping lightly, but now the weight of another life beside him kept him sharper than usual. Nalin lay curled in the blanket near the fire, her breathing soft, her face relaxed in a way it had not been since he found her. He told himself he would rise before dawn and keep them moving, but exhaustion pinned him longer than he wanted. When the first thin line of daylight spread across the horizon, Elias pushed himself upright, joints stiff and back sore. He bent to stir the fire to life, coaxing the embers back into flame, when he heard the sound, distant hoofbeats. He froze. At first, he thought it might be traders or riders heading to the post, but the rhythm was too many, too coordinated. His pulse quickened as he reached for his revolver, standing slowly. The hoofbeats grew louder, echoing through the quiet land until shapes appeared along the ridge. Riders. Half a dozen, maybe more. He narrowed his eyes, and as they came closer, he recognized them for what they were: Apache women, mounted on lean ponies, their hair braided tight, their shoulders wrapped in blankets, their faces stern and unreadable. They moved like people used to hardship, straight-backed, weapons slung at their sides. Nalin stirred, woken by the noise, and when her eyes lifted to the horizon, her body stiffened. She pulled the blanket tighter around her, then pushed herself up on her elbows, her voice breaking into quick words in her tongue. Elias didn't understand them, but he saw her expression, shock first, then something like relief. These were not strangers. They were her kin. The riders circled down the slope, dust kicking up under their horses' hooves, until they drew up just short of the camp. Elias kept still, revolver held low but ready. He knew exactly what they saw when their eyes landed on him. A lone white man, ragged and armed, standing over their wounded sister at a fire that wasn't his. He felt the air tighten, a wall of suspicion pressing in on him. One of the women, older than the rest, guided her horse forward. Her gaze was sharp, her jaw set, and though she spoke to Nalin in quick Apache, her eyes never left Elias. He knew the look. It was judgment, it was calculation, it was the measuring of a threat. His gut tightened. If they decided he had harmed her, he would not leave this place alive. Nalin spoke fast, her voice strained, her hand lifting to point first at herself, then at him. Her words tumbled out, broken and urgent, and though Elias couldn't follow the meaning, he caught the shape of her intent. She was defending him. She shifted, pressed her hand against her chest, then stretched it out to touch his arm with her fingers, light but deliberate. It was the same gesture she had used by the fire, showing them that this man had not brought her harm, but life. The older woman's eyes narrowed, her face unreadable as she listened. Another rider muttered something under her breath, and a younger one spat in the dust, glaring at Elias with open distrust. He felt his heartbeat hammer in his chest, sweat beating at his temples. Every instinct told him to step back, to lower the revolver, to show he had no fight in him. Slowly, carefully, he slipped the weapon back into its holster and raised his hands just enough to show he meant no harm. The silence stretched long, broken only by the shifting of horses' hooves. Elias could feel their eyes cutting into him, weighing whether to believe Nalin or not. He fought the urge to speak. Words would do little here. Instead, he kept still, letting Nalin's voice carry. She spoke again, softer this time, her hand never leaving his sleeve until finally the older woman gave a curt nod. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it wasn't death either. The women dismounted one by one, moving to Nalin's side. They touched her ankle, checked the bandages Elias had wrapped, murmured to her in low voices that sounded more like comfort than interrogation. Elias stepped back, giving them space, feeling strangely out of place now that she was no longer alone. Yet, as he moved away, Nalin's eyes followed him. And when one of the younger women barked something sharp in his direction, she shook her head quickly, defending him again. Elias felt the knot in his chest loosen just slightly. Whatever storm he had walked into, she was willing to stand between him and its worst edge. He exhaled slow, steady, watching the morning sun spill over the horizon and cast long shadows across the desert floor. The moment he had feared since giving her the horse had come. Her kin had returned. He didn't know what his place would be now, whether he'd be cast aside or tolerated, but as Nalin's hand had lingered on his arm, he realized something he hadn't dared believe. She wanted him here, even when she no longer needed him to survive. The sun had climbed high when the Apache women finished tending to Nalin's ankle. They had cleaned and re-wrapped the wound, speaking to her in low tones, their hands gentle but their eyes often cutting toward Elias. He kept himself busy at the edge of the camp, unrolling his blanket, collecting what little would lay nearby, and checking the horse's tack. He knew his presence was tolerated at best, a foreign shadow at the edge of their circle. Still, he stayed, because leaving her now, after what he had given up, felt like betrayal not only to her, but to himself. The women were cautious with him. They did not strike or threaten, but every look carried a warning. One of them, younger and fierce-eyed, never stopped watching him, her bow kept within arm's reach. Another, older, the same woman who had spoken first, seemed to bear the authority among them. She asked Nalin questions in their tongue, gesturing at Elias, and though he could not follow the words, he understood the meaning well enough. Who is he? What did he do? Why is he here? Nalin answered as best she could, sometimes slipping into broken English to bridge the gap. No hurt. Help. Walk. She tapped her chest, and then his, repeating the same motion she had made that morning. Elias stood quiet, his hands open at his sides, letting her speak for him. If they were to allow him near, it would not be by his words but hers. As the day stretched, the women prepared food for what they had hunted. A pair of rabbits were skinned quickly, meat roasted over a low fire. Elias's stomach growled, but he waited, uncertain if they meant to share with him. When the food was ready, Nalin spoke up again, gesturing toward him. There was some hesitation, some muttered disagreement, but eventually a small portion was passed his way. He accepted with a nod, eating slow, aware of their eyes studying him. To them he was a man who had once been enemy, maybe still enemy, and it would take more than a shared meal to change that. By late afternoon, work began. Two of the women moved to repair gear, another went to gather more wood, while the youngest disappeared into the brush to check snares. Elias rose, stretching his aching legs, and without asking joined the one hauling wood. She glanced at him sharply at first, but said nothing as he stooped to gather a heavy bundle of branches. He carried them back without complaint, setting them near the fire. Then he cut strips of rawhide to mend a bridle, his rough hands steady from years of ranch work. Slowly, the camp quieted around him. The suspicion did not vanish, but neither did they send him away. As dusk fell, another small moment came. One of the younger women cut her hand while shaping an arrowhead, a sharp slice across her palm. She hissed, shaking it out. Elias moved closer, holding up a strip of clean cloth. Her eyes narrowed, mistrust flaring, but he spoke calmly, "Let me." For a long second, no one moved. Then Nalin nodded faintly, and the woman allowed it. Elias bound the wound gently, his calloused hands careful not to press too hard. When he tied the knot and stepped back, the woman pulled her hand away quickly, but the edge of her suspicion had softened. That night, as the camp settled, Elias sat apart by the fire. The women spoke among themselves, voices low, sometimes glancing his way, sometimes laughing quietly with Nalin, who now leaned against one of her sisters, her face brighter than it had been in days. He felt the distance between them, but also the slow change. He was no longer only a stranger. As the fire crackled, Elias thought of the questions that still lingered. Why had Nalin been left alone? Were these her only surviving kin? What fate had scattered them across this desert? He did not ask, not yet. He knew the answers would come in time, if they were meant to. For now, his role was clear: to work, to endure, and to prove by action what words could not carry. When Nalin's gaze found his across the fire, she gave the smallest nod, a quiet recognition that he had done enough to be allowed here, at least for now. Elias returned the nod, his jaw tight, but his chest lighter than it had been in years. He was not welcomed, not yet, but he was not alone either. In a land that had taken everything from him, that was more than he had thought possible. The days settled into a rhythm Elias had not expected. Each morning, the women broke camp and moved slowly across the desert canyons, their ponies sure-footed along narrow trails, their eyes always alert for signs of danger. Elias walked beside them on foot, his boots grinding over stone and sand, his body growing leaner from the constant labor. He carried water, cut wood, and lifted burdens without complaint. At first, no one spoke to him beyond what was necessary, but the longer he endured without asking for more than his share, the less they looked at him like an intruder. Nalin's ankle remained bound, but she grew stronger with each passing day. She no longer winced at every movement, and when the group stopped to rest, Elias sometimes saw her testing her weight carefully, her face drawn in determination. At night, when the firelight painted the canyon walls in shifting orange, she would sit closer to him than before. She did not speak much, but when she did, she tried short English words, repeating them with the same patience she had once shown when giving him her name. Fire, water, walk, night. Elias answered in kind, his deep voice steady, offering the words back to her, so she could hear their shape. It was a quiet exchange, but gave them both something to focus on besides silence. Still, Elias knew the sisters watched. He felt their eyes in the dark when Nalin lingered beside him, and he knew they were asking themselves if he was safe to keep near. He never overstepped, never reached for her, never demanded her attention. If she chose to sit beside him, it was her choice alone. That, more than anything, seemed to ease their suspicion. One evening, as the fire burned low, Elias was mending the sole of his boot with a scrap of rawhide when Nalin eased down beside him. Her gaze was fixed on the flames, but her voice carried just enough for him to hear. Family gone. The words were halting, uncertain, but clear enough. Elias paused, his hands still over the leather. He turned to her, his brow furrowing. She didn't look at him, only stared into the fire. After a long silence, she spoke again, this time in her own tongue, voice trembling. Though he did not understand the words, the pain was unmistakable. She was speaking of loss, of those who were no longer here. Elias listened without interrupting. He thought of his own past, his parents buried in Missouri soil, his brothers lost to war, the faces of men who never returned from battle. For years, he had carried that weight alone, convinced no one else could understand it. Yet here, beside this girl who had seen her family torn apart, he felt the sharp edge of recognition. Different lives, same emptiness. When she finally went quiet, Elias nodded once, his throat tight. Me too, he said simply. Her eyes flicked to him, searching his face. He did not explain further. He couldn't find the words, and she wouldn't have understood them anyway, but she seemed to understand enough. Her expression softened, and for the first time, she reached out and rested her hand lightly on his forearm. It was not long, just a few breaths before she withdrew, but it was enough to change the air between them. The next morning, Elias rose before the others and hauled water from a narrow spring. When he returned, he found Nalin standing carefully on both feet, testing her ankle in the sand. She wobbled, catching herself on a stone, but she stayed upright. Her sisters rushed to steady her, speaking in sharp tones, but she waved them off and looked toward Elias. Her eyes carried the same determination he had once seen in young soldiers who refused to stay down. He felt a flicker of pride for her strength, though he kept it hidden behind his usual hard stare. By the time night fell again, Elias knew the questions hanging in the back of his mind had not vanished. Where would he go when Nalin healed enough to ride without him? Would her sisters turn him out once he was no longer useful? He told himself it didn't matter, that he had given what he could and that should be enough. But when Nalin sat beside him once more, leaning against the warmth of the fire, her quiet presence settled the fear he refused to voice. For the first time in years, he felt something close to belonging, and it unsettled him more than the thought of being alone ever had. The morning came quiet, the air cooler than the days before, and for the first time since Elias had found her, Nalin stood on both feet without wincing. Her ankle was still bound, but the swelling had gone down, and she leaned only lightly on the shoulder of one of her sisters. Elias watched from a short distance as they tested her step by step, their voices low, guiding her. A knot of tension loosened in his chest. She was healing. What seemed impossible that first night in the desert, her surviving it all, was now real. The sisters gathered around their fire for breakfast. They roasted strips of rabbit, passed around water, and divided berries collected the day before. Elias joined without needing an invitation this time. One of the younger women, who had once looked ready to strike him down, handed him a small portion of meat without hesitation. He accepted with a nod, chewing slowly, feeling the change in the air. He was no longer being tested. He was being included. Still, questions pressed in on him. What came next? Would they leave him behind now that Nalin could ride again? Would they return to their people and decide a white drifter had no place among them? He had lived long enough to know not to expect more than what was given, yet part of him feared losing what had quietly begun to matter. Nalin seemed to sense it. After the meal, she walked toward him, her steps steadier than before, her eyes fixed on his. She stopped in front of him and reached for his hand. He hesitated, unsure, but she took it firmly, lifting it for her sisters to see. Her voice carried clearly, first in Apache, then in broken English. No enemy. Stay. The word struck harder than any he had expected. For a moment, he couldn't answer. He felt the weight of years of wandering, of towns that had turned him away, of nights spent with no fire and no company. To hear that word, stay, was something he had not dared imagine. He looked around at the circle of women. Some were cautious still, but none challenged her. The older sister gave a single approving nod, her expression steady, as if the matter was settled. Elias swallowed hard and squeezed Nalin's hand once, not trusting his voice. In that simple moment, the questions that had followed him since he laid his horse's reins in her hand were answered. He was not being cast out. He was being given a place. That evening, the camp took on a different shape. Elias worked side by side with the women without feeling watched. He hauled water, split branches, and helped string meat to dry. When the fire was lit, he sat not apart but within the circle, and when the food was passed, it reached him without hesitation. The horse he had given up grazed nearby, no longer as yet no longer something he grieved. He had traded it for something he had thought lost forever, a sense of belonging. As darkness fell and the desert wind swept through the canyon, Nalin sat close, her shoulder brushing his. She was no longer the broken figure he had found half dead in the dirt, but a young woman alive, steady, and surrounded by her kin. He was no longer the man who had only wandered for survival. Together, they were something different, two people bound not by words but by the choice to remain side by side. Elias stared into the fire, the warmth of it reflecting in his tired eyes, and felt peace settle over him in a way it hadn't in years. There was no uncertainty left, no loose ends. He would stay. He had a place, and they had accepted him. For a man who had thought himself unworthy of belonging, it was enough.